For 93 days, she had maintained her vigil from this rocky outcrop overlooking the Velvrak's den site, documenting every behavior, every interaction, every subtle communication between the apex predators below. Her research station, a modest collection of camouflaged equipment and shelter, had become as much a part of the landscape as the ancient pines that dotted the mountainside. The Velvraks were magnificent creatures, standing nearly 3 meters tall when upright, their sleek obsidian fur rippling with each movement, eyes like molten amber scanning their territory with predatory intelligence. They moved with a fluid grace that belied their deadly reputation across 7 star systems. These were the creatures that had once brought entire colonial fleets to their knees, the nightmare stories whispered in spaceport bars from here to the outer rim, but here, in this sanctuary, they were something else entirely. Parents, Saren watched. The alpha female, whom she had privately named Shadowmere, grooming one of her cubs with surprising gentleness. The cub, barely the size of a large dog, tumbled and played with its siblings in the morning sunlight, their juvenile spotted coats a stark contrast to their parents' midnight black. Their playful chirps and growls echoed across the valley, a sound that had become as familiar to Saren as her own heartbeat. The sanctuary protocols were absolute: observe, document, never interfere. Terria had been established as a neutral zone after the Predator Wars, a place where the galaxy's most dangerous species could raise their young without fear of poachers, researchers, or military intervention. The Galactic Council's Xenobiology department had fought for decades to gain even limited observation rights, and violation of the non-interference directive meant immediate expulsion and permanent ban from xenological research. Saren understood the rules. She respected them. But as she watched the cubs play, something stirred in her chest that had nothing to do with scientific curiosity. These weren't the monsters from the military briefings. These were children, innocent and vulnerable, dependent on their parents for protection in a galaxy that would exploit or destroy them without hesitation. The adult Velvraks knew she was there, of course. They had known since her second day on the mountain. Occasionally, one would pause in its activities to stare directly at her position, amber eyes boring into her soul with an intelligence that was both alien and unnervingly familiar. They tolerated her presence the way one might tolerate a persistent bird, aware, but not threatened enough to act. That morning, as Saren updated her behavioral logs, she noticed something different. The adults seemed restless, their usual graceful movements sharp with tension. Shadowmere kept looking toward the forest's edge, her ears swiveling to catch sounds beyond human hearing. The male, Night Strider as Saren had named him, paced the perimeter of their territory with increasing agitation. The cubs, oblivious to their parents' concern, continued their games. 3 of them wrestled in a furry pile while the 4th, the smallest and most adventurous, had wandered closer to the tree line than usual. Saren made a note of the behavioral change, wondering if perhaps another predator species was moving through the area. As the day wore on, the adult Velvrax's anxiety only increased. By afternoon, they had gathered the cubs closer to the den entrance, their powerful bodies forming a protective barrier between their young and whatever unseen threat had captured their attention. Saren found herself leaning forward, straining her enhanced hearing equipment to pick up whatever had spooked the galaxy's most fearsome predators. The forest was too quiet. Even the native bird analogues had fallen silent, their usual chattering replaced by an ominous stillness that made Saren's skin crawl. She checked her perimeter sensors, but they showed nothing beyond the normal thermal signatures of Terria's indigenous wildlife. As evening approached and the twin suns began to set behind the mountains, casting long shadows across the valley, Saren fell to growing unease. In all her months of observation, she had never seen the Velvrax display this level of sustained anxiety. Something was coming, something that even apex predators feared. She settled in for what promised to be a long night of vigilance, not knowing that by morning, everything would change, and the line between observer and participant would be irrevocably crossed. The attack came with the first light of dawn, shattering the morning stillness with a sound that would haunt Saren's dreams for years to come. It wasn't the roar of the adult Velvrax or the mechanical whine of spacecraft engines, it was the high-pitched, terrified screaming of cubs in mortal danger. Saren jolted awake from her restless sleep, her scientific instruments clattering to the ground as she scrambled to her observation post. Through her scope, she could see chaos erupting in the valley below. A sleek, unmarked drone had descended into the Velvrax territory, its anti-gravity field generators humming with deadly efficiency. The craft was small but sophisticated, clearly designed for stealth and rapid extraction. A poacher's vessel, the adult Velvrax were in full defensive mode, their earlier anxiety proving tragically prescient. Shadowmere lunged at the drone with incredible speed, her claws raking across its armored hull, but the craft's defensive field sparked and repelled her attack. Night Strider circled from the opposite side, trying to flank the intruder, but the drone's pilot was experienced, keeping just out of reach while its grasping beam focused on its prize, the smallest cub, the adventurous one who had wandered too close to the tree line, was caught in the drone's tractor field, its tiny body suspended helplessly in the air as it screamed for its parents. The other cubs had fled toward the den, their spotted coats barely visible as they pressed themselves against the rocky outcrop, but their sibling was beyond their parents' reach. Saren's hands trembled as she activated her emergency communication array, but she knew help was hours away at best. The sanctuary's security forces were deliberately minimal, stationed at the system's edge to avoid disturbing the wildlife. By the time they could respond, the poacher would be long gone, disappeared into the black market networks that traded in exotic creatures across the galaxy. The drone began to rise, its precious cargo secured in the tractor beam. The cubs' cries grew more desperate, a sound that seemed to pierce straight through Saren's chest and lodge somewhere near her heart. Below, the adult Velvrax roared their fury and anguish, but they were earthbound creatures, powerful but helpless against aerial attackers. Saren found herself standing, though she couldn't remember making the decision to rise. Her hands moved automatically to her equipment pack, fingers closing around items she had never intended to use as weapons, emergency flares, a thermal disruptor meant for clearing ice from her instruments, a plasma cutter for emergency repairs. The non-interference directive echoed in her mind like a mantra: observe, document, never interfere. Her career, her life's work, everything she had spent decades building would be destroyed if she acted. The Galactic Council would strip her credentials, blacklist her from the scientific community, possibly even charge her with violation of interspecies treaty, but the cub's screams cut through every rational thought, every carefully constructed argument for maintaining professional distance. This wasn't data to be collected or behavior to be catalogued. This was a child being torn from its family, a young life about to be condemned to a cage for the entertainment of some distant collector. The drone was 30 meters up now, beginning to angle toward the forest canopy where it could disappear among the trees. In seconds, it would be gone forever, and with it, any chance of rescue. The adult Velvrax below had fallen silent, their mighty forms suddenly seeming small and defeated as they watched their offspring disappear into the sky. Saren's training warred with her instincts, scientific protocol battling against something more primal and human. She thought of her own childhood, of her mother's protective embrace, of what it meant to be helpless while someone you loved was in danger. The cub wasn't human, but its terror was universal, a language that transcended species. The moment of decision stretched like an eternity, balanced on the knife's edge between duty and conscience. Then, somewhere in the distance, the cub's screams grew fainter as the drone gained altitude, and Saren realized that some choices couldn't be unmade by future regret. She grabbed her equipment and began to run down the mountainside, her feet sliding on loose scree as she abandoned her post and plunged toward the valley floor. Behind her, 3 months of careful observation data scattered in the wind, but ahead lay something far more important than any research project: the human move. Saren's boots pounded against the rocky slope as she half ran, half slid down the mountainside, her equipment pack bouncing against her back with each jarring step. Above her, the poacher drone continued its ascent, but she could see it was moving more slowly now, the pilot probably congratulating himself on an easy score while staying low enough to avoid the sanctuary's orbital sensors. The adult Velvrax noticed her approach immediately. Shadowmere spun toward her with lethal grace, lips pulling back to reveal fangs longer than Saren's fingers. For a heartbeat, predator and human stared at each other across 20 meters of morning-lit grass, two species that should have been natural enemies. Saren could see her own reflection in those molten amber eyes, could feel the weight of the creature's assessment. Then Nightstrider's roar split the air, drawing his mate's attention back to their captured cub, and Saren understood with crystal clarity that she wasn't their enemy right now. They had a common purpose, a shared desperation that transcended the ancient enmity between their kinds. The drone was 40 meters up now, angling toward a gap in the forest canopy. Saren pulled the thermal disruptor from her pack, a tool designed to clear ice that could, if overcharged, produce a focused beam of superheated plasma. Her fingers flew over the device's controls, bypassing every safety protocol she had memorized during her training. "Come on," she whispered, watching the charge indicator climb toward the red zone. "Come on." The drone's pilot must have spotted her, because the craft suddenly accelerated, rising faster toward the protective cover of the trees. But the maneuver brought it closer to Saren's position, well within range of her improvised weapon. She raised the disruptor, sighted along its length, and fired. The beam of superheated plasma struck the drone's underside with a brilliant flash, overloading its port-side gravity generator in a cascade of sparks and smoke. The craft lurched sideways, its tractor beam flickering as power was rerouted to compensate for the damage. For one terrifying moment, the cub fell free, its small form tumbling through the air. Shadowmere moved like liquid lightning, covering impossible ground in a single bound to position herself beneath her falling offspring. The cub landed on her back with a soft thump, immediately burrowing into her thick fur with desperate relief, but the drone wasn't finished. Its pilot, clearly experienced with this kind of interference, had already compensated for the damage. The craft swung around in a tight arc, its remaining tractor beam arrays powering up for another attempt. This time, it would be ready for ground-based attacks. Saren pulled out her emergency flares, military-grade illumination devices that burned at over 3,000 degrees. She had 6 of them, enough to signal for help across half a continent. Or, she realized with grim determination, enough to blind a drone's optical sensors at close range. The poacher craft descended again, moving more cautiously this time, but still focused on its prize. The cub had been separated from its mother again in the confusion, its small form visible near the den entrance where it huddled with its siblings. Saren broke into a run, crossing the valley floor with desperate speed. The Velvrax adults flanked her without conscious coordination, Shadowmere to her left and Nightstrider to her right, all 3 of them converging on the same point. It was impossible, unprecedented, human and Velvrax working together, but in that moment, it felt as natural as breathing. The drone dropped lower, its tractor beam reaching for the cubs like a giant's grasping hand. Saren armed 2 flares simultaneously and held them at the craft's sensor array. The first one struck the drone's hull and bounced off, but the second lodged in a ventilation grate and detonated in a brilliant burst of white-hot magnesium. The drone's optical systems overloaded. Instantly, its pilot flying blind as emergency alerts screamed through the cockpit. The craft wobbled in midair, its automated systems struggling to maintain stability while smoke poured from the damaged sensors. Shadowmere chose that moment to leap, her powerful haunches launching her 6 meters into the air with cat-like grace. Her claws raked across the drone's already damaged underside, tearing through armor plating and severing power cables in a shower of sparks. The drone crashed into the forest edge with the sound of rending metal and splintering trees. For a moment, silence returned to the valley, broken only by the crackling of small fires and the distant sound of the pilot's emergency beacon. Saren stood in the center of the clearing, breathing hard, her makeshift weapons scattered around her feet. The cubs were safe, clustered together near their parents, but she knew that the real consequences of her actions were just beginning. She had crossed a line that could never be uncrossed, violating every principle of xenological research. In a single moment of desperate action. But as she looked at the reunited family, at the small forms pressed against their parents' protective bulk, she found that she didn't regret her choice. Some things, she realized, were more important than protocol. The aftermath of the attack brought a silence unlike anything Saren had experienced in her months on Terria. The forest seemed to hold its breath, as if the entire ecosystem was processing what had just occurred. The poacher drone lay twisted among the shattered trees, its hull split open like a metallic fruit, emergency systems blinking weakly in the gathering smoke. Saren remained frozen in the center of the clearing, suddenly acutely aware of her position. She was standing less than 10 meters from 2 apex predators and their cubs, her human scent thick in the air, her actions having just violated every treaty and protocol that governed interspecies contact. The rational part of her mind screamed that she should retreat to her observation post, gather her equipment, and prepare for the inevitable consequences of her interference, but Shadowmere was watching her with those intelligent amber eyes, and something in that gaze held Saren motionless. The great predator took a step forward, then another, her movements deliberate and measured. Nightstrider remained with the cubs, but his posture had shifted from defensive to simply alert, as if he too was trying to process this unprecedented situation. The smallest cub, the one who had been trapped in the tractor beam, separated itself from its siblings and padded toward Saren on unsteady legs. Its spotted coat was ruffled from its ordeal, but its eyes, so much like its mother's, showed no fear as it approached the human who had helped save its life. "Easy," Saren whispered, more to herself than to the approaching youngling. "Easy. There, little one." The cub reached her and, to Saren's amazement, pressed its small body against her leg, seeking comfort from the very species that galactic law said should be its natural enemy. The warmth of its contact sent a shock through Saren's system, the reality of interspecies contact hitting her with overwhelming force. Shadowmere approached more slowly, her massive head lowered to Saren's eye level. This close, Saren could see the intelligence burning in those alien features, could sense the careful assessment taking place behind those predatory eyes. The Velvrax's breath was warm against her face, carrying scents of pine and wildness and something indefinably other. Then, in a gesture that would haunt xenobiologists for generations, Shadowmere gently touched her forehead to Saren's shoulder, a sign of recognition, of acknowledgement. of something that transcended the barriers between species. The moment stretched between them, human and Velvrax connected by an understanding deeper than language. Saren felt tears she hadn't realized were there sliding down her cheeks, the emotional weight of the morning finally crashing over her. "I'm sorry," she whispered, though she wasn't sure what she was apologizing for, the interference, the violation of their space, or simply the fact that her species and theirs had been enemies. For so long. A sound from the crashed drone broke the spell. The poacher pilot, apparently still alive, was attempting to restart his engines, the damaged craft shuddering and sparking as its systems fought against the extensive damage. He would be calling for backup, Saren realized, or trying to escape. Before Sanctuary security arrived. Nightstrider's growl rumbled through the clearing like distant thunder, his attention focused on the downed craft. But instead of moving toward the potential threat, he looked to Saren, as if waiting for her lead. The gesture was so unexpected, so contrary to everything she knew about Velvrax's behavior, that it took her several seconds to process what was happening. They were asking for her help. These apex predators, capable of tearing apart armored combat vehicles with their bare claws, were deferring to a soft, clawless human because she had proven herself in the moment when it mattered most. Saren moved toward the crash site, the Velvrax family flanking her in a protective formation that felt as natural as walking with longtime companions. The irony wasn't lost on her. She had spent months trying to understand their social dynamics from a distance, only to find herself accepted into their pack structure through a single act of desperate courage. The poacher pilot was a Thraxian, his scaled hide scored with cuts from the crash, emergency oxygen mask covering the lower half of his reptilian face. He looked up as they approached, his eyes widening with terror as he took in the sight of armed Velvrax and their unlikely human ally. "Please," he gasped through the translator hanging around his neck. "I was just following orders. The buyers, they pay good money for Velvrax cubs." "I never meant," Shadowmir's roar cut him off, a sound that promised violence and death if he spoke another word. But it was Saren who stepped forward, her voice calm and steady despite the adrenaline still coursing through her system. "Sanctuary security will be here soon," she told him. "If you're smart, you'll stay exactly where you are and hope they reach you before my friends here decide they've heard enough." The pilot nodded frantically, clearly recognizing the precarious nature of his position. Around them, the forest was beginning to stir again, normal sounds slowly returning as the immediate danger passed, but Saren knew that nothing would ever be normal again. She had crossed a line that separated observer from participant, scientist from protector. Whatever came next would have to be built on this new foundation of trust between species that were never supposed to understand each other. The cub at her side looked up at her with trusting eyes, and Saren felt the weight of a future she had never imagined settling on her shoulders. 3 weeks later, Saren sat in the Galactic Council's austere hearing chamber, facing a panel of 12 representatives from across known space. The charges against her were extensive: violation of the non-interference directive, breach of sanctuary protocols, unauthorized engagement with protected species, and destruction of private property. Each charge carried penalties that could end her career and result in decades of imprisonment, but the real attention wasn't on her words, it was on the footage playing on the chamber's central display, recorded by her own surveillance equipment and broadcast across the galaxy. The images showed something that xenobiologists had declared impossible for over a century: voluntary cooperation between humans and Velvrax. "Dr. Vale," the Altarian Council member's synthesized voice echoed through the chamber, "do you understand the implications of your actions?" For 300 years, the Velvrax have been classified as irredeemably hostile to human contact. Your intervention has fundamentally challenged our understanding of interspecies relations. Saren looked up at the panel, her hands steady despite the magnitude of what was happening. With respect, Counselor, I think our understanding was flawed from the beginning. We based our assumptions on encounters during wartime, when both species were fighting for survival. What I witnessed on Terria was different. It was parenthood, protection, family bonds that transcend species barriers. The human representative, Dr. Martinez from the Xenological Institute, leaned forward. The footage shows the adult Velvrax not only tolerating your presence but actively coordinating with you during the rescue. This contradicts everything we know about their territorial and aggressive nature. Because we were seeing them in their natural environment, caring for their young, rather than as weapons of war, Saren replied. The cubs weren't threats to be eliminated, they were children to be protected. That created common ground. On the display, the moment when Shadowmere touched her forehead to Saren's shoulder played again, drawing murmurs from the gallery where xenobiologists and military officials watched the proceedings. It was a gesture that had been analyzed by experts across the galaxy, debated in academic papers and military briefings alike. There's something else, Saren continued, her voice growing stronger. After the rescue, the Velvrax family didn't return to their previous behavior patterns. They maintained proximity to my observation post, brought their cubs within visual range regularly, and on 3 occasions, Shadowmere brought prey animals and left them near my shelter. The implications hung in the air like a charged particle field. Gift-giving behavior between species had been observed before, but never between humans and Velvrax, never with such clear intentionality. Dr. Martinez consulted his data pad. Our analysis teams have been reviewing your behavioral logs from after the incident. The changes in Velvrax territorial patterns, social interactions, and response to human presence are unprecedented. Other observation posts have reported similar modifications in predator behavior across 17 different worlds. It's spreading, the Centaurian representative noted, her crystalline features reflecting the chamber's lights. Whatever happened on Terria, it's affecting human-Velvrax relations across the galaxy. We are receiving reports of reduced hostile encounters, instances of Velvrax withdrawing from conflict zones when human civilians are present, even cases of apparent protective behavior. Saren felt a flutter of hope in her chest. Perhaps what we are seeing is evidence that the hostility was never inherent. Maybe it was learned behavior, passed down through generations who only knew us as enemies. The cubs I helped save will grow up with a different understanding of what humans can be. The chamber fell silent as the implications sank in. If Saren was right, if the human-Velvrax conflict had been perpetuated by misunderstanding rather than biological incompatibility, then centuries of warfare and fear might be ending not through treaties or negotiations, but through a single act of protection directed at the most vulnerable members of their species. The Altarian Councilor's voice carried a note of something that might have been wonder. Dr. Vale, preliminary reports suggest that cub survival rates in systems with human observation posts have increased by 37% in the past 3 weeks. Velvrax families are actively relocating to be near human settlements, behavior that contradicts every model we have of their territorial instincts. They are seeking protection, Saren realized, the pieces falling into place. They know that humans will defend their young, even against their own species' laws. We've accidentally proven that we can be trusted with what they value most. The hearing continued for hours, but the outcome was no longer in doubt. The footage from Terrier had changed everything, opening possibilities that no one had dared to imagine. The charges against Saren were quietly dropped, replaced with a new assignment, heading the first joint human-Velvrax research initiative, based on Terrier, focused on understanding the bonds that could form between former enemies. As Saren left the council chamber, she thought about the small cub that had pressed against her leg in trust, about Shadomir's gentle touch of acknowledgement, about the family of apex predators who had accepted a lone human into their pack. She had moved when the cubs cried, and in doing so, had moved the galaxy itself toward a future none of them could have predicted. The human had moved, and everything had changed.